grace, how sweet the sound that saved.
One of the most potent powers on earth. It can change lives in an instant. Everyone has it. It's the power to forgive.
The Taliban shot me on the left side of my forehead. I do not even hate the Talib who shot me. And this is the forgiveness that I have learned from my father and from my mother.
Forgiveness is available, just like oxygen outside of a dank room, waiting for you to open the window so that the fresh air can come in.
In my mind, all offenses are forgivable.
Everett Worthington has spent more than 30 years studying forgiveness. The VCU psychologist has written a dozen books on the subject.
I got interested in studying forgiveness really because I was doing a lot of couple counseling. Well, as soon as you start counseling couples, you're into forgiveness issues. You could train people in communication and conflict resolution, but then they held on to these old grudges. So I felt like we had to do something about that. We really understand quite a bit about forgiveness. I think there are over 4,000 scientific articles that have accumulated. We know that unforgiveness really does have a lot of cost. Unforgiveness is a stress response. There's this hormone called cortisol. Cortisol, if it is chronically elevated, will basically affect every physical system in the body. In terms of mental health effects of unforgiveness, really, I think a lot of that comes through rumination, the universal bad boy of mental health. Rumination is playing bad events over and over in the mind. It is implicated in anger disorders, in depression, in anxiety disorders. So rumination really can affect people's mental health in many different ways. I define forgiveness as two different experiences. Decisional forgiveness is making a decision about how you intend to act towards someone who's harmed you or how you intend to act in the future. You say, I'm not going to get even with them, I'm not going to get revenge on them, I am going to treat them as a valued and valuable person. That's called decisional forgiveness. But I can make a decision to forgive someone and still feel enormous resentment and bitterness and hostility every time I think about it. So that must suggest that there's a second type of forgiveness that we call emotional forgiveness. And this is when I replace negative, unforgiving emotions with positive, other-oriented emotions. Emotional forgiveness, though, is usually a longer process. Emotions are unruly and don't obey our wishes as much as decisions do.
Authorities in Charleston, South Carolina are searching for a gunman who walked into a downtown church around 9 p.m. Eastern Time Wednesday night and opened fire. 9 people are dead.
And just 2 days later, many of the families somehow found it in their hearts to forgive the shooter.
Mr. Roof, you're charged with 9 counts of murder.
I would never give it over again, but I forgive you.
You know, I forgive you and my family forgive you.
Now, you have to ask, what kind of forgiveness was that? My bet is that for most people, it was primarily a decision to forgive. That's kind of the thing that Christians feel is required of them, is to make a decision.
And I acknowledge that I am very angry. We have no room for hate, so we have to forgive. I pray God on your soul.
People may still have negative feelings, but they have made a decision to act differently, and they may follow this for the rest of their life and deal with the emotional unforgiveness and hopefully erode that down to zero over time.
You think you're letting somebody else off the hook, but you're actually letting yourself off the hook. Because if you keep it, there's no healing.
It always is surprising when somebody is able to forgive something that seems to an outsider almost unforgivable. One of my favorite examples is Chris Carrier. He, as a 10-year-old boy, was abducted, was taken out in the swamp, stabbed repeatedly, and then the man placed a gun against his head and shot him, and it came out in his eye. Well, he survived that, and then like 20 years later, a police officer came and said, "We've always thought we knew who did this, but we never had any kind of evidence. But this guy is dying and does not deserve to go out of this world without being confronted." And so he took Chris out to this man's house, and instead of confronting the man, he walked up to the man and said, "So who's taking care of you?" And the guy goes, "I'm taking care of myself." Well, he's clearly laying in bed, unable to take care of himself. So Chris Carrier took care of this man for the last couple of weeks of the man's life. That's just an astounding story. There are heroes of forgiveness like this, I think, everywhere.
There's Mr. Mandela, Mr. Nelson Mandela, a free man taking his first steps into a new South Africa.
When Nelson Mandela became president, he was so magnanimous and so able to just put aside all of these systematic harms that the people of South Africa had experienced, and even personal harm of being imprisoned.
One of the things that is difficult for me to comprehend is that we spent such a long time here.
You can see this vision in his mind of blacks and whites able to work together in a reconciled society.
The time for the healing of the wounds has come.
And so you could take a distancing perspective and say, well, what happened to me is minor in that case, and I forgive that because this hope is so important and so grand. My belief is that forgiveness is something universally available to people. Our mission is to see whether we can help people forgive by using a very accessible do-it-yourself workbook. We're going to apply the Reach Forgiveness model so that we see whether it actually works in mainland China, in Hong Kong, in Indonesia, in South America, in Ghana, in the Ukraine, all of these different places throughout the world with different cultures. We're going to help them make a decision to forgive. And then we enter into trying to help them have an emotional experience of forgiving. They will go through 5 steps to reach forgiveness. R stands for recall the hurt. So we can't forgive if we're denying that we've been hurt. And hopefully try to look at things a little differently than we have been. Empathy, feeling with another person, seeing things from their perspective, is highly related to forgiveness. We try to help them empathize with the person, to think about, I've hurt people in my life, and I usually meant well. I meant to help them, but it didn't work out that way, or I lost control, lost my temper. We help them use an empty chair dialogue, pretending that the person's there and talking to that person, then getting in their chair and trying to talk back. And that helps them empathize with what the position of the other person might have been. The idea is we're emotionally replacing the negative with positive. A stands for give an altruistic gift. And I know that the person doesn't deserve forgiveness. They hurt me, so they didn't earn the right to forgiveness. So I'm going to give them this emotional gift. And so altruistic forgiveness is declaring that you forgive. Commit to the forgiveness you experience. Maybe they can achieve a lot of forgiveness working through this workbook, but maybe they need to go through the workbook again to get all of it, and then hold on whenever you doubt. Because we do doubt that we've forgiven. We doubt usually because if somebody hurt me, my body has been conditioned to respond with fear and anger when I think about that. And then the very last part, we get them to apply this reach forgiveness model again and again so that it broadens out the application and they are becoming a more forgiving person and building that virtue into their life. Back in 1995-96, on New Year's Eve night, my mom was murdered. It was apparently a young man who was going to burglarize the house. He ended up bludgeoning her with a crowbar that he had used to break the window to get in the door. And I sat down to write a eulogy for my mom. It suddenly dawned on me that here I had gone through like almost 24 hours at that point, and I had never allowed myself to think the word forgiveness. And I thought, whose heart is darker here? Is it the heart of a young man with impulse control who's angry and afraid? Or is it me, the Christian, 48 years old at that time, person who's counseled people about forgiveness, written books on forgiveness? I thought, my heart is darker than his heart. But I knew that I could be forgiven. And I thought, if I can be forgiven for the darkness in my heart, who am I to hold unforgiveness against this young man? And I was able to forgive that young man. I think, personally, I think there is a higher purpose and that people are meant to eventually be reconciled. It's a goodness of character, a character strength that not only is good for me, but is also good for other people. The idea that God has given things like reasoning and language to everyone, regardless of their belief system. And I believe that hope and gratitude and forgiveness and humility and all of those are part of common grace that anyone has access to.